All right, there we go. Here we are. Dan will be with us when he's done drinking his coffee. So I left you. Let me adjust this a little bit. I left you out here to figure out the technology solution. I came out here
and I failed.
Dead links and everything.
This is what he does. He delegates and is disappointed by the results. I just want to give a shout out to my boy Mark Cuban here. Come join us in the Podshop. This episode is inspired by you. It sounded fine previously. Thanks,
all right,
Jane.
we got some work to do.
All right, so basically, Jane's in the chat. Here's the idea. As Jane knows,
producer Jane of the Tropical MBA podcast.
Yep. This is basically how we produce a show. We sit down, we kind of debate ideas, we argue, we kind of try to crack each other up for
an hour.
Then we get distracted. Then we flip on the mics and try to have a conversation, and that conversation gets edited down. But today, since I think it's fair to say we're a little, lonely and bored, a little bit.
Speak for yourself. At the time of my life, we decided to do a live podcast. Yeah.
All right. So let's do it.
This was inspired by Mark Cuban. It was also just inspired by the Twitter sphere. Man, people are just tweeting helpful things, crazy things,
everything.
I think people are cooped up in front of their computer, and so what I think we're going to try and do today is distill some of these tweets, give our reactions to some of the things that people are thinking about, specifically around this virus that's going around and how it's impacting the economy and small businesses. A lot of us have not seen anything like this ever before.
Yeah, and today I think we're going to talk about how small business owners can take action, specifically when it comes to cutting costs, which costs to cut, how should you proceed as normal, how should you, take bold action. I think that's the main story here. Obviously, we're not going to be commenting on the virus itself, but more its downstream effects. But I think before we get into that, I got to ask you the question: how bad is this going to be? What's your take right now? How are you thinking through that?
It feels like we're a week or two in. The stock market is down by 30%. Restaurants and bars are closed all over the country. There's varying degrees of quarantining.
World.
Yeah. Kirby Lane is a local restaurant chain, a breakfast restaurant chain here in Austin, laid off 700 people 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And I think this is just the beginning. I think the stress on the economy is going to be massive, and it's going to last for months, if not years.
There was a tweet by Brent Beshore who, I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically suggesting that GDP could be cut by 50% this year, and that 1 in 3 essentially Americans could lose their jobs.
I'll read it. Yeah. He quoted the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis President James Bullard predicted that U.S. unemployment rate will hit 30% in the second quarter because of shutdowns to combat the virus, with an unprecedented 50% drop in gross domestic product.
Yeah. I mean, let me just do a hot take. A lot of people are talking about rebound. Like, that's the thing that a lot of government officials are talking about. That's the core of this episode. We're going to talk about like Mark Cuban's thoughts that maybe you could take some loans to like get, sort of past this, like bridge the trouble and then rebound. And I really believe that the chances of a rebound happening in the next quarter are the same as total financial meltdown of the US dollar or something similar to that. I mean, I'm just not that optimistic right now, because when you look at the actual indicators on the ground, like the actual economy happening, like there's all these overlays of the economy. There's the news media, there's like investors, there's the markets, there's all this kind of vague stuff. But then on the ground, there's like just people aren't buying things. People can't buy things. People can't go to work. And I think that's going to persist. And that is the economy at the end of the day. And I think I'm not optimistic at all. That doesn't mean it's not a potentially amazing time to be an entrepreneur. I mean, first off, just spending so much time at home, you're seeing a lot of people use this time to be creative, to reevaluate things, to ask important questions about what might be next.
The downstream effects, it's like you said, it's interesting to start talking about the rebound when the downstream effects haven't even begun. All right. So I was reading something about Airbnb just the other day, and the market seems to be starting to get flooded again with just regular rentals.
Yes.
People turning their Airbnbs into regular monthly rentals, long-term rentals, because nobody's traveling on Airbnb. So,
well, and forget about the renters being able to afford things. What about the people who own the rental properties being able to
that are completely over leveraged, right? Potentially, that have 4 or 5 properties that bought them at full retail value. And now they're in a situation where they can't rent them.
Right.
Yeah, the downstream effects from this are going to be massive. And here's one of the things that I think is interesting is like we're only 2 weeks in, and people are folding like cheap decks of cards, and businesses are folding, left and right. And we're going to talk about this today. If you're 2 weeks in and it's crisis mode already, a couple chat questions already in YouTube in the right hand side there. We're not exactly sure how this works, but if you do type in your questions, as long as they're appropriate, we'll try and answer them.
All right, so let's focus on cutting costs and Mark Cuban, and then we'll get to Q&A. So this is just one little segment that might make it to Thursday's show. Here we go.
Mark Cuban,
he looks beautiful here.
He was on the Twitters.
By the way, can we just, before we get to the real thing, let's just do the real thing, which is we always crack each other up before. What's with the black and white photo here, man? You can't get a color printer?
No, I can't get a color printer.
Isn't success in life a color printer in your closet?
No, I've had color printers for years, and let me tell you, they always let me down. You're always out of cyan. or purple or whatever color you're out of, and you can't print
like a legal document because you don't have blue.
Exactly.
That's how they get you.
So here's what I did. I went out and bought the most robust black and white printer with 1 cartridge. You could buy, because that's what I need 99% of the time.
You got a young kid who's going to want to do arts and crafts, and he's going to want the cyan.
Nope.
All right.
Black and white only. Mark Cuban on Twitter. This is what he said, and this is what started us talking about this. First tweet a couple days ago on March 19th. If you run a business, before you fire anyone or any more, you have an obligation to yourself, your employees, to find every government loan available today and those that come soon. Find the time. When the government loans start, you want to be already in line and an expert.
Okay.
All right. So why are we talking about Mark Cuban, first of all? He's written a couple books that we've read. I followed him for a long time.
He's on Shark Tank, man.
Yep.
He owns the Dallas Mavericks. He's business leader.
He's self-made American business person.
Sure.
And I think early in my career, he was definitely someone that I looked up to. I don't know about you.
Sure.
And so
I think there's plenty of things to like and dislike about this tweet. This tweet isn't aimed at small business entrepreneurs. And what I'm seeing is a lot of business leaders that run different sorts of enterprises, political enterprises at scale. The Dallas Mavericks, like as of, 3 weeks ago, is a $3 billion property. This guy was a potential presidential candidate. He's on a national TV show.
You actually, there was a clip of him floating around the internet when he got the news. He was at an NBA game, and he got the news that the NBA had been shut down. And you just watch this guy totally flip out. He like passes the phone on to all his
I had the
friends.
same reaction. Yeah. Like I couldn't believe. I mean, it's absolutely unprecedented in our lives. Like for those of you that are a bit younger, like the crash in 2008. 9/11. I mean, 9/11 had the same kind of emotional vibe that we're feeling right now, but not the economic one. Like it's the effects just weren't this massive. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that just yet. We'll save it for another day. But with Mark Cuban, there's a lot to not like about this too. And what I'm concerned about is
the overall idea. Let me just cut right to the overall idea of this tweet. The overall idea is basically that you should do anything possible in these times to save your business and save everybody that works for you.
Yeah, save jobs.
Okay.
I think that's the thing, because there's this idea that everything's going to get righted once we sort out this virus thing, and that we need to keep people in jobs. That's sort of like an American duty. It's an entrepreneurial duty, all this kind of stuff. Cool if you own the Dallas Mavericks. Cool if you're sitting on $1 billion. I think this is problematic advice for most of the listeners of this show. And the reason is there's, two different kinds of costs in a business. There's costs that are associated with your product directly, and there's overhead.
Okay.
And the reality is that most staff are part of that overhead thing. Some are cost of goods sold, some are the overhead thing, and staffing scales with sales volume in a lot of companies. And this idea that you're going to go out and take a loan to to do something very risky, existentially risky to your business in order to do something ultimately good, like this idea of valor, this idea of, being generous and stuff, I think is super problematic. And it worries me, I guess, a little bit that people might think that this is like the right thing to do to potentially protect people from a reality that's right in front of us, which is like, yeah, we really enjoyed like these jobs in that business for the last 2 years, but like it can't exist in this environment. So why are we going to go take debt on to sustain it? Why don't we actually face the reality? And again, thinking like in a small context versus, the Dallas Mavericks have probably hundreds of people that come and like cook up French fries and serve the fans. And maybe that will come back. That's an institution. But a lot of our small businesses, frankly, they're not going to come back in the next few months. And this idea that you're going to like protect people and like be this matriarch or patriarch to them, I think it just doesn't resonate with me,
I want to get back to the Kirby Lane story. At the beginning of this, Kirby Lane is it's this local restaurant chain. They laid off 700 people.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking about Kirby Lane specifically laying people off so early in the game, I thought like, wow, this just started. Like this, you just close your restaurants down. Like, can't you afford to like keep people around for like a couple months? Essentially, that's what Mark Cuban has said that he's going to do. He's going to continue to pay people. But then I started to think about it, and I was thinking like, maybe the best way to ensure that these people do have jobs when this thing kicks around again, if it ever does, is to lay them off immediately, right? That way you can afford to do it. Because if you're Mark Cuban and you're worth $1 billion, there's a good chance that you can sustain this for months, if not years. And if that's what you want to do, I think it's
that's
totally
one of the
cool.
good things. Like be generous for sure.
Be generous.
But part of being generous is being honest with information about what's happening to people to whom it matters so much. It's like I think there's a lot of this, even the way, one of the things that's come through, and I got to be a little political here, is like a lot of people have been praising the way Governor Cuomo has been speaking with Americans. And for those of you who don't know, he's the governor of New York. And part of, it came off my head, he's like treating us like adults, and he's not like feeding us these little pellets of like, everything's going to be okay, and I'll take care of you, and you're going to have a job. It's like, here's the reality, like, so life stuff sometimes. I mean, that's okay. Like, we're adults. We can be generous with each other in both information and action. That doesn't mean you have to, overextend your business to do that.
And maybe the best way to make sure that people have the jobs that you're offering, like Kirby Lane did, is to basically, lack of a better term, terminate them, and then try and ice block your business. I want to talk about what ice block your business means, and then try and rehire them again once this blows over. But
also, taking action early, they might be the first to get certain government benefits, and the business might be survive through the thing and all that kind of stuff.
Let's talk about overhead though, real quick before we talk about ice blocking your business. You were looking at Rolexes the other day. I'm very interested in cars and watching these asset classes potentially go down in price, right?
Yeah.
It might be a good opportunity to buy.
I'm not looking at Rolexes because I want to bling bling. I'm looking at them because they're like a cash equivalent, like a gold bar, but cheaper kind of thing.
Right. And so when we talk about our businesses and some of these different asset classes, in the business specifically, it's real easy to do certain things overnight, right? It's real easy to like fire 100 people overnight. You send out a memo. It's real easy
for you.
Yeah, in theory. I'm not talking about emotionally.
The mechanics.
Yeah, the mechanics of it are easy. It's real easy to cancel your subscriptions and things like that. It's not easy to sell your IP. It's not easy to release the building that you're in.
Right.
And it's not easy to do a lot of these other like things that take 30 to 60 days.
It's not also advisable, right? Like those are like assets in a way that overhead related to sales volume, including staff, is not. So I think that's it's just strange to me that like you run into the burning building to save the IP, to
Mm-hmm.
save the inventory. I think there's just things are flipped, and as is normal when we think about small lifestyle businesses, and by small I mean sub 15 million, we're just running a different game than everybody else. And the mainstream media, even people that are so cool and supportive of bootstrappers like my boy Mark Cuban here, the messaging just I don't think is appropriate for what we're trying to do, which is survive this thing. And also, like I said, like, big corporations are bummed out right now. Main Street is bummed out right now. Anybody with any relative or friend or with someone that's older or immunocompromised is really worried. Everybody's bummed out right now. But you know who's a little bit excited? Entrepreneurs. They're just a little, there's gotta be a party that has a little bit of fun with this. It's a snow day, you're locked at home.
Yeah.
And you're forced to ask the big questions about how you're going to face this challenge, how you're going to help people. There's a lot of amazing challenges. I just read a tweet thread about you can go to look at what happened to Chinese economy in the last 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And all the industries that are on the rise, all the things that people want in these I'm not saying be an opportunist in that way, but like, look, there's real challenges to solve, whether that's just personal or economic. But there's got to be a part of you that is freed up from the fear, to say, hey, I'm going to have to make some tough decisions. And this idea of like going down to the bank and getting a loan to like make sure everything's like going to be the way it's always been. Well, I just think that that's really risky, and you should have really good justification for that.
It might not be. I think what you're saying is true about the NBA being an institution. So certain things have a higher percentage chance, I think, of coming back to the way that they were before. Now they're going to have to make changes and tweaks too. I mean,
but also when they fall harder. I mean, that's the cool thing about a lifestyle business and a lifestyle entrepreneur is you're agile, right? But like, all these NBA franchises are worth, say, $3 billion 2 weeks ago, and now say air travel is severely restricted for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
And TV rights go to streaming, and all of a sudden what was 3 billion is worth, 300 million. And that's a bigger cut than any of us as small business entrepreneurs would need to sustain. And so the bigger they are, the harder they fall, kind of thing. And by the way, to kind of just point out, sorry, I'm just the interrupter. For those of you watching, this is why we edit things. This is how we do it. So basically what happens is, like, this is the sausage room. We sit here, we argue with each other, we disagree, we crack each other up sometimes, and then sort of like 25% of it to 50% of it actually doesn't ever make it.
Sorry, you have to listen to this.
Sorry, it's an apology. It's an apology.
I want to get back to this idea though, real quick, Dan. I'm going to read another thing that Mark Cuban tweeted out, but this idea of the paradigm shift. Okay, so
yeah,
right now I can imagine things going back to normal. A couple days, we find out that there's a bunch of testing kits available. This isn't as bad as we think, and the economy starts to go back up. Right? Okay. Maybe things could resemble something normal if this kind of blows over in the next week or two, which I don't think it will.
No.
That being said, there's going to be massive paradigm shifts, and getting back to this idea of taking a loan for your business to think that things will be the same normal that they were before is flawed thinking, I believe. So yeah. The idea that Mark Cuban is presenting here is basically like try and preserve everything that you have going right now. Because the implication of that basically is that it's all going to be the same.
Because we're America, and the way we do business needs to be retained. Like all the jobs that we had 2 weeks ago, like we should have those jobs. They should be saved, all that kind of stuff. And I love the word paradigm, because like there's this famous book that we've talked about a few times on the pod called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And actually, I'm reading a book about the influenza, where there was like sort of a disease paradigm that people had at one time. And when you get these anomalies, it doesn't allow you to like integrate that knowledge. And you can be in a business paradigm in your own life, which is you have a worldview that works. Like I hire X number of salespeople, they bring in X number of sales, and like I use this much leverage in my business, and here's the addressable market. Mm-hmm. And you're very right that like this might not be just like a pesky little piece of information or a pesky little blip. This might be a paradigm shift, which means you have to change the entire way you approach your business.
Mark Cuban tweeted today, "There's only one way we're going to get money into the hands of small businesses immediately so they can retain employees, pay them all their bills, And that's for the Treasury to guarantee all overdrafts. Let SMB, small to medium sized businesses, write checks as they always have, but they won't bounce. So basically, now he's calling for the government to step in and basically ensure that small to medium sized businesses can continue to pay their bills.
Well, and here's the jerk in me wants to say something like, as of a month ago, the majority of Americans have less than $1,000 of savings. What are we trying to get back to? You know, that what are we all doing here? And I guess this has been like something, I know there's a lot of people in this listenership that are kind of like getting the first phone calls from some friends this week and being like, oh, interesting. We've all been at the pajama party for years now, and now everybody's here.
Pajama party meaning
remote work,
yeah,
fiscally responsible, drive a car that you can afford, like all this basic stuff, like spend less than you earn. The things that we talk about for 10 years, and now all of a sudden we're getting phone calls. We've been playing Dungeons and Dragons in the basement, and the cool kids are knocking on the door now saying, what's going on down there in the basement? And I'm just not so sure why are we going to like reduce the value of our currency, put out all these loans, make sure like everybody, oh, well, last time we bailed out like the big banks and that didn't really work. So now let's just bail out everybody. You know, let's just write blank checks to people. I know people are going to suffer, that's for sure. But, and I don't know the right thing to do, but I guess at least in that specific angle, it does create a little bit of annoyance in me because I'm not so sure things were so great is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. And I think what this show is about is focusing on small to medium sized businesses. How can we as entrepreneurs make sure that that we can continue on? And sometimes that means laying off 700 employees, you know?
Right. And when we started the whole thing, because that lifestyle that everybody's trying to take loans to sustain right now, we thought it sucked. We really did. Right. Like, I'm living off of credit cards, like paying tons of rent, working all the time, long commutes, all that. It's just like, what are we trying to save here, guys?
Yeah. Well, I think this is the time of the episode, and this is new, so I'm just making that up right now.
Me? Oh my God.
Where we answer some of the questions that are in the chat and YouTube.
Great.
So a couple people have chimed in here. Jeff, hey guys, my business is real estate, mostly investing. I'm trying to assess my personal risk of not
Jeff?
Being paid by tenants who are in industries that have had hours cut, etc. Yeah, this is we talked about this a little bit last night, which is basically if your business is propped up by people that are in these industries, like the service industry, that are paying rent, what happens to you? Well, downstream effect, right?
Yeah.
This is why, in my opinion, leverage is dangerous, because it dominoes like this. So, if Jeff is in a position, and maybe he is or maybe he isn't, to maybe ease back on the rent, right? So if you want to protect your asset, if you want to be able to hold your asset indefinitely, you might need to scale back. So if you're charging people $600 in rent, maybe you need to go to them and say like, hey, these are trying times. How about 300? And maybe they'll say yes, maybe they'll say no. And you need to figure out, is 300, can you at least pay your bills that way? If you have a stockpile of cash, maybe you put in 300, they put in 300, and how long can you do that for? So I want to get back to this idea of ice blocking your business that I brought up earlier. The idea is basically, you remember these like sci-fi movies where people have these diseases and they're really wealthy and they just freeze themselves with the hope in the future,
I'm still hanging on to that hope.
There's going to be a cure for the disease. And that's kind of the idea of ice blocking your business, right? It's like this idea of like, how can we freeze this thing? How can we slow down the molecules? So maybe at a future date we can thaw and continue with some resemblance of what we were doing before.
I got a handful of friends
and continue with some resemblance of what we were doing before.
I got a handful of friends and associates that think I'm insane for not having 5 or 6 apartment mortgages right now. And we were speaking with a real estate investor last night who's a close friend of the show, and he was saying, all these young people acting like a plane can't fly into your building or whatever. And maybe they didn't live through a recession, but bad things happen, and it's worth like designing businesses around those. In terms of Jeff's specific case, it would be interesting. I love this idea of redefining that relationship, because there's always like this way that real estate investing works. It's like you don't talk to your clients, you get this amount of leverage, you get this kind of place, and like you set them up with this management company, and well, now's a chance to maybe go over and bring a cup of coffee that's been sanitized, sit on the table with them at 6 feet apart, and say, let's partner here for the next 6 months. You guys are in a tough spot, I'm in a tough spot, or whatever.
Yep.
But yeah, things don't have to, and that's part of the excitement of these times, is that you can
have these conversations. And I don't know how over leveraged you are, Jeff, but I think my advice in this situation would be to figure out how much runway you can afford yourself. Meaning, if you try and cut a deal with your tenants and you put in whatever cash you have, like, how long can you extend this out? I have a friend that I was talking to.
I would go to the bank, right? You absolutely want to hang on to every red cent and every asset right now. You don't want to be running right now if you can help it.
You don't want to be running right now because guys like Dan will come in and try and scoop it up for half price. I mean, that's the reality of what might happen 6 months from now, is that if there's all these defaults and things like that, people that have been waiting around with cash like me, going to try and buy things at 50 to 75% off.
Yeah.
I have a friend that owns a couple different properties here in Austin, and he's a landlord, but he also does what's basically he does owner financing. So he sells these properties directly to people. And one of his tenants before this happened was like 4 months late. A single mom, going through a situation, didn't have a job and whatnot. And he did exactly what you suggested, which is he called her up and he said, look, she had put down like $60,000 on this house. And she was in a position where she was going to lose that all because she'd missed 4 payments. And my buddy's a good guy, I think. And he called her up and he said, look, like, you're in a situation here where you're about to lose this house and all the equity that you put into it. Let's come up with a plan that makes sense for you to get back on track here. Because, it's just one of these situations where I think we have to act like people to people. We have to be somewhat generous.
And who might start acting like people is banks and their policies.
Let's hope so.
Well, who knows? And the idea, what are the banks going to do with all these houses? They can't handle them. One of the interesting things about this particular economic downturn is that it is like everybody's in this ship together, right? Like, everybody's going down, of course. And so there's going to have to be some collective action or some interesting new ways of thinking through this stuff that come through. Because if 30% of mortgage holders are going to foreclose or whatever, what's the bank going to do with thousands and thousands of homes on their books that nobody can afford and nobody can buy? I mean, it's not an asset in that way anymore.
Jeff says, I've got some debt, but I can afford a 30% plus loss for probably 12 months. Okay. That's a good place to start, I think. Is this going to take 12 months to rewrite itself? Probably, I would guess.
It might be worth, one of the other things that's like maybe a little bit extreme, but finding new places to push. And so I keep mentioning the banks because it's like the last place you'd think, kind of like you go to the tenants, you go to like outside lenders, you go to like your other businesses to borrow from yourself. But what about testing the bank's apparatus? Like, how aggressive are they about following up with you for payments? Like, they're going to be overloaded too. And it might not be unethical just to say, look, I'm just trying to survive, so ultimately I can pay them. So maybe testing their apparatus, even if like your particular contact at the bank can't pull strings for you, there might be a structural string there for you to explore.
Andrew Warner types in and says, how do you balance saving enough cash reserves for today versus buying in the dip? I think this is a good question.
It's a great question.
So the first part of the question, how do you balance saving enough cash reserves for today? Today's over, right? So I saw somebody who said, this was like probably a week ago. It says like the panic, it's too late to panic. And I think they're right. Like, the idea is like, I panicked like a month ago when I started reading, maybe a month and a half ago when I started reading about this in China. I was like, wow, there's no way this isn't reaching the United States. Just watching what's going on. There's planes still flying.
Dan's flying back.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way that this isn't going on. So I've been preparing for something like this for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I've been not living up to my means. I've been stacking cash. I've been waiting for an opportunity to buy
But
things at
now,
50% off. So if you're in a position, if you've been calculating for that to happen, I think now is the time to capitalize on something like that. Probably.
before we get to Andrew's question, I have to ask, because this has been like the major source of financial debate between me and you and all y'all in this community, and then the normies out there. The normies are all saying that we were nutbags and we were the tinfoil people by having so much cash. Why aren't you having your money work for you?
Well, you lost. You know, if you had $1 million in the market the last couple of years, you were making around $100,000 a year off that, and you just extra $100,000 a year in your bank account.
Yeah, that's compelling.
Like, why would you not participate in that?
Now's why. Yeah.
Maybe you didn't take it out in time.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have options now. So
anyway, forget about all that. Let's get back to the question though.
So how do you buy in the dip? How do you identify the dip?
That's the thing. And then how much of your total net worth do you risk in the dip? I think it depends on some things. Like, one is there's like market value of assets, and then there's personal value as well. So like, you know, if you think about it on the personal side, like now's a great opportunity to purchase a home, that the one that you really want to live in for the next 10 or 15 years, like something like that, a piece of real estate or some other asset akin to that. So that's like a personal value that I think would
be different than maybe a business proposition.
Yeah.
How do you calculate where the dip is? I don't really try and do this. I don't know about you, Dan, but like I don't try and buy at the very, very bottom. I'm like a value buyer. So for me, it's like about the value of the asset. Like, is this a good value? And I think if you're trying to time the dip, like that's for gamblers, and I'm not a gambler, so that doesn't really work out for me. But we know what asset prices are today. We know what they were a month ago, and we're going to see what they were 3 months from now. Now, if you truly believe that this is all going to go back up and to the right, which some people believe, and I think certain asset classes will come back and reach their full potential of where they were before.
Sure.
And I think other ones won't. So I think this is a discussion that I don't feel completely qualified to answer, because it encompasses so many different asset classes.
Do I feel qualified to answer? Except for how to make the ultimate Triscuit stack and boxed wine combo.
God, see, this is what happens most of the time too. Dan just derails my thought process with his Triscuit joke. So if anybody laughed about that, let me know, because maybe it was worth
Zero
derailing.
people except for me.
Point being,
edit it out.
If you're watching certain asset classes, like I watch certain asset classes like cars or property or some types of businesses, then you understand what the market value is oftentimes. And so only you will kind of understand, like, is this a good deal or not? Should I be buying this? Is this going to make sense for me? All right. I want to get to a couple more questions, Dan.
It also depends a little bit, like the risk you're going to take is on the liquidity of that particular asset. But good rule of thumb is if you can get it for, half price.
Kevin says,
fire away.
COVID-19 is clearly a black swan event. In terms of TMBA style businesses, remote-based, non-brick and mortar, what is the most ideal way to structure a business so that it's the most anti-fragile? And then he says, or is it less about making the business anti-fragile and more about structuring your life to be more anti-fragile? Does that make sense? What say you? How do you structure an anti-fragile business, or should you make your life anti-fragile?
Well, that's a great question. It's really hard to answer because it's such a big topic. Essentially, the anti-fragile approach is, number one, and I'm probably wrong about this, but number one, prevent yourself from personal ruin. So like even things like you stopped motorcycle racing.
Well, I had to be fair, like they closed down the venues, but the idea was basically like, this would be a bad time to end up in the hospital.
Well, even, riding your motorcycle regularly on public roads is preventing personal ruin. And then you take that the whole way down to personal finance and business finance, which is like, this worst case scenario thinking, like what's the worst that could happen is a fruitful exercise in anti-fragility. And then the next step, once you've sort of, you have cash reserves. And look, at this point, even is anybody going to be surprised if the US dollar or anything gets screwed up at this point? Why? I mean, again, thinking in terms of what's the worst case scenario. And then in terms of the next step, it's placing a lot of small bets that are affordable to place and that something could pop, and that's basically, anti-fragility.
The definition of anti-fragile is almost like not knowing what the future will hold, but being prepared for it. So
no, it's benefiting things that benefit from disorder. So when there's a shakeup, like right now in the immediate term, the people that are benefiting are cash investors right now.
who would have bet on medical ventilators?
That content producers, yeah, entertainment stuff, to the
Grocery
home
delivery.
Yeah.
Right. Point being is a lot of times you can't predict what's going to go
You
up in a
can't.
situation like
can't,
this,
yeah.
right? So the best that you can do though is you can kind of, to Kevin's question, you can kind of make your life anti-fragile. So, and I don't necessarily think this means like being diverse, because I'm very cash heavy right now, and that I'm going to see if that works out for me. But I think if you diversify, if you spread yourself real thin, then you don't have an opportunity to capitalize in a situation like this. Now, if a certain asset class goes down, you're not going to be totally financially ruined. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So you got a little bit of real estate, you got some cash, you got a business, you got cars, watches, whatever it might be. But in a situation like this, cars will go down, watches might go down, houses might go down. Like you might watch all your asset classes go down.
I think the anti-fragile business owner, if we're to turn that persona into a character, would be the one that is capable of going, quote, all in on that opportunity without any risk of personal financial ruin. And that in a crucial moment or with a crucial piece of information, they're not personally committing their time and energy and all of their resources to that particular all-in opportunity. They can pull up stakes, in other words, and they can put it all down on the next number that they feel is going to hit. And that's different from this sort of theme of the episode or the segment today with Mark Cuban, which is this idea of like, this is the thing, this is the way it's always been. That's like this robust business. Like we got 115 people, half of them working the phones. They're gonna be working the phones the same way. The anti-fragile business owner sees immediately like, this isn't going to be my ruin if this goes down. And so I have a diversity of bets, some of which are more appealing in this current environment. And I'm going to go put energy there. I think that's like the anti-fragile business. It's a big concept. Great question. I mean, I feel like we could sit here with a group of people and like flesh that one out for hours.
Final question. This is just a fun one. Liam asks, you guys headed back to Southeast Asia anytime soon? I'm currently in Chiang Mai and all the co-working spaces are closed, but it feels like a good spot to hunker down and wait. What's your thoughts on being in America right now versus being in Southeast Asia? How do you feel about that?
The biggest concern I'd have is the legality of the visa issues. So, a lot of digital nomads have the Thai Elite visa. And so if I had the Thai Elite visa and I was in Chiang Mai right now, I think I would feel just as comfortable, maybe a little bit. It's unclear to me how America's going to handle this. And one of the big problems for digital nomads is medical care. And so, unless you got like a really robust policy going to the hospital in America, it's tough business, like if you have to be on a ventilator for a month, how much might that cost you versus if you had to be on a ventilator in Thailand. So, I'd feel comfortable in Thailand right now.
Well, I think we got a directive, and this was just a headline I read, but the president of the United States said, like, come home or stay there.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's getting enforced or
it would be interesting to see, like, if you're on, like, say, a 6-month visa and then you can't come home and it's 7 or 8 months, and there's going to be a lot of legal cases for sure.
How is the Thai government going to handle that, right?
Yeah.
If you can't leave. So definitely some questions there. It is interesting to think about.
Chiang Mai always a good place to hunker down. I love that town. I can't say I don't miss it. So, yeah, it is a fascinating thing. Like, it'll be interesting to see, like, the optimistic side. Like, what's the end game for this? Imagine 15 years from now, God willing, we all survive and stuff. Are like your kids going to be like, Dad is like oddly obsessed with washing his hands. He just, you know what I mean? Like there's going to be like the Purell generation or whatever, the Corona generation. But it is interesting, like where you got stuck and hold up. And certainly here in Texas seems like a relatively nice spot.
Well, we just got back from Marfa, Texas, and Big Bend, and interesting happened in Marfa is they told everybody to leave.
Oh yeah,
like the town was like, you guys can't stay here
there
anymore.
are 2,000 people that live in Marfa. One of the locals when we first showed up said, like, don't go on anybody's property by mistake or else they'll shoot you. And we were like, yeah, right. And they were like, yeah. And I was like, okay. So anyway, there's 2,000 people in Marfa, and they took proactive steps to kick all the outsiders out.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting trend to see if that happens a lot more in America. Like basically,
like a ruralism kind of thing or localism.
I think it totally makes sense for Marfa. There's one grocery store, and if you have a bunch of tourists in there, I mean, that grocery store was designed and built to service the people that are in town there. And if you have a bunch of people like us in RVs, rushing out to the middle of nowhere, what's going to happen to that community? And I think ultimately they've made the right, like, get out of here. We've got enough to sustain us. You got to go back to wherever you came from. So I'm interested to see if that happens in other parts of the country, as people maybe try and get out of these cities a little bit more.
Yeah. Tell you what, it's a good time for zombie vans. We're looking at a lot of it's possible that like domestic travel is freer than international travel here for a while. So interesting time to like explore the RV life and do some exploring if that's responsible and possible within the coming months. Also, potentially a lot of people out on bikes. You can cycle safely. So I think you can need more than 6 feet though.
Yeah.
Because
droplets.
Just droplets. But good time for cycling, good time for podcasts, good time for reading books, good time for retooling and thinking about how you want to approach your business in the future.
Cool, Dan. Well, this is episode 1 of the Podshop. If you guys liked it, let us know. Maybe we'll show up again tomorrow. See you.